Give Dean the original.
All right, we're now on the record.
Later on.
A work session related to the recent election. And Ms. Jones, Municipal Clerk, I think will be leading this discussion. Let's go around the room and introduce ourselves, starting with Ms. Red.
Barbara Jones.
Forrest Dunbar.
Christopher Clonsted.
Pete Peterson.
John Weston.
Suzanne Brandt.
Great. Okay. And now we've been joined by
Amy Solberg.
Good. All right. So, Ms. Jones, would you like to kick things off?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. We wanted to come back and have an opportunity in a work session to answer any other more detailed questions that you might have had outside of certification. I know that we did have a couple of questions that might not have been answered at the certification meeting. One was cost, a financial analysis, and thanks very much to the Assembly Budget Analyst, Rose Foley. She has prepared these documents for us, and we can talk about those. And then the one other issue that I'm not sure that we've talked about is undeliverables. I think we've talked about them a little bit, but I think we probably should talk about them a little bit more. And those are two issues that I have that I think we should talk about, Mr. Chair. And then you can see if there's anything else that you'd like us to talk about.
Okay. Please continue.
All right. Undeliverables. I think that we know that there were 22,000 voters with the condition code UN undeliverable for the state of Alaska. We did not deliver ballot packages to those 22,000 voters. In addition, after we delivered the 195,000 or 194,507 ballot packages, we received approximately 20,000 that were returned. We don't have the exact number because we ran as many of them as we could through the mail sorting machine. It captured the voter registration number and also the information on the yellow barcode from the post office. The problem is some of them didn't have the barcode or the yellow sticker. So we still have a handful left that weren't able to scan. So we know it's about 20,000. So the issue then that we have is that we have the 22,000 plus an additional 20,000 for a total of about 42,000 ballot or voters whose record is, their mail is undeliverable. What we've done will save us money next year because you've instructed us not to mail to voters who are undeliverable, but I think that that means that we'd be mailing to about 179,000. Of those undeliverables, about 1,500 showed up at the accessible vote centers, and they'll have their addresses corrected, so they'll be out of that category.
When you say undeliverable, 1,500 out of undeliverables, I was under the impression before that was out of the 20,000 returned, but you're saying it was out of the total 42,000.
That is correct.
Okay. Any questions on undeliverables? Oh, Mr. Dyson.
As I understood what you said, 20,000 were the ones the state didn't have competent addresses for in their voter list, correct? 22,000.
Mr. Dyson, I'd argue that the voter list belongs to the state, so all 42,000 are incorrect in the state stated case.
Does the state run those against PFD account records?
Well, because the PFD voter initiative passed, they're starting to do that. So the PFD voters that came over into this election were people who registered for their PFD from March 1st to March 31st of 2017. So we've seen those voters come over. But we'd have to talk to the state about this, so this is hearsay. But my understanding from the state is that there are some concerns about using PFD address because PFD addresses aren't always correct. They are We are most concerned about that our bank account is correct on our PFD. And so as long as our routing number and bank account are correct, there's not a lot of mailing going back and forth. Now, I have heard that banks will not accept a PFD if the address isn't correct. But for our purposes, a correct address has to be, 123 North, 123 East, Main Street, Main Avenue, apartment number. We get into a lot of details that might not come across as PFD. So there are some other solutions that we need to work with. PFD is one, DMV is another. The U.S. Post Office has a system called CAS, and the post office runs addresses through CAS and gets the correct address. So we have some work to still do.
Yeah, you're telling me more than I
Okay, sorry.
exactly wanted. But I used to be operating on the presupposition that Alaska citizens are very diligent about keeping the records on PFD current so they can get it. But I'm inferring from what you said that the state has not been doing the diligent job that they need to do to make sure that their voter registration has the best and correct serviceable addresses that they could.
Through the chair, Mr. Dyson, I'd say two things. Number one, the PFD is not maybe the best place for voters to watch their addresses, so you are correct, I am telling you that. The State Division of Elections has told us that those are not the best addresses. Number two, the issue with the state and the reason we want to work with them is one of the concerns that they have is they can't change addresses unless a voter tells them to. So if a voter enters their address wrong, the state leaves it wrong. So we have some work that we need to do to make some decisions about, maybe we need to change state law. Maybe we talked yesterday about ethics and elections. If people file address change with the U.S. Post Office, we need that to get to the Division of Elections to update their address. There are some things that we can do.
Okay, if I may continue.
Yes, sure.
So, we didn't give you, or do you have by ordinance, the responsibility to overturn every rock, to do everything you can to get the right address for our voters?
Through the chair, no, Mr. Dyson, I do not have that obligation, and I'm not sure. I think that could be an issue that we could look at, but it could be problematic since we're using the state database.
Yeah, so I want to be able to accurately say the problems with the undeliverables were not with your office. The problems were with the State Division of Elections, by and large.
I would argue that is essentially correct. It is the State of Alaska voter registration database.
Yeah, so I think we have a bit of a responsibility to encourage and work with the State Division of Elections to do their best they can. But I personally can be reluctant for us to take that on for our area and so on. But anyways, I'm looking for and got a justification that by and large the problems weren't ours. And you did a pretty darn good job with all the workarounds you could think of. And so, Mr. Chair, I would ask that we think about what we can do to encourage the state and offer our cooperation.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Weddleton.
Well, it seems we are doing something very extreme to try to get that right, because I thought you said for the first 3 years, we have to send a postcard in January, and we get a bounce back, we follow up, and that costs money and time, and to me, a very huge effort to check people at work.
Yes, I would agree, Mr. Weddleton. As in the second page of the document that I provided to you on the cost, if you look under the 2018 election ongoing costs, both under printing and postage, I have a little note there that the K&H postcard for printing was $16,066. And to mail the K&H postcard, it was $80,000.
That's in here. Where's that?
It's on the second page. It's right after the little. Pardon?
What does K&H stand for?
K&H Election Services is the name of the printer.
Thank you.
And so, but there's almost $100,000 that we spent on that mailing, Mr. Weddleton, and that you are correct that is required for the first 3 years of vote-by-mail elections.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? So it's required by us, by our own code.
Correct.
Do you think it's wise for us to continue doing that? Or have we already received most of the utility from that first year, or do you think in the second and third year we will get significant improvements to our voter rolls by continuing with that process?
Mr. Chair, I would suggest that a lot of voters probably did not know what that postcard was this first year. I think we could probably improve the postcard, because one of the things that shocked me was the number of voters that contacted us and said, I don't live in Alaska anymore and I want to cancel my voter registration. In fact, we had 14 people that actually returned the ballot packages and wrote that inside. So, but my question is, well, why didn't they return the postcard? Why didn't they cancel with the postcard? And people didn't do that. So I think the postcard needs to probably have a little bit more information. If you don't want to vote, if you don't live here anymore, please cancel. But that's one of the dilemmas that the state has. I can't cancel someone else's voter registration. Only that person can do so.
Mr. Weddleton, you have a
I
follow-up.
would say an effective postcard has as little information as possible.
Oh,
Don't put
okay.
more information on there. If you don't want Alaska anymore, tell us right now. Nothing more, people, you know. But I think that's for marketing and increase. That's what's sweet on this.
Just Magneto's head.
And for
Nothing else.
Magneto's head.
Mr. Constant.
Yeah, that raises the kind of possibility of working with the state on that specific tool. If we're gonna spend $100,000, or roughly that amount, then maybe there's some partnership when we do that, we can do with them. They send it out for us, and we pay them for it, so that when it returns to them, it is in fact canceling to them, or some way to work it out where it is in fact doing both jobs. Right? And I don't have an answer to the specifics, but I think there might be a way, if we're going to spend $200,000 in 2 years to clean up the voter rolls, that if we can get them to work with us on it, maybe we can make it official and effective.
Do you have an answer to that, Mrs. Jones?
Through the chair, yes, and I'm wondering if you're looking puzzled, because we did exactly that. The postcard, excuse me, you know, it was a half sheet. It had a barcode on it, and the barcode, our project manager put the barcode on it, the instruction of the state, and then for all of the postcards that were returned, we went to the state and the state just scanned the barcodes. So the original number of undeliverables was about 12,500 or 10,000, and we added, thank you, we added an additional 12,500 people to that undeliverable list from that postcard. It was a lot, but it just wasn't all of them.
Mr. Dice.
Yeah, thank you. I want to be able to compare the cost of doing this mail election as opposed to the way we used to do it. Give me a rough idea of the numbers, please?
Okay, if you'd like to move on, then we're on page 2 of the handouts. This is the one that says 2018 vote by mail expenses and vote by mail capital investment. And so you can see that our 2018 election costs, we have, Rose has done a very nice job breaking those out. We have the number $1,014,900. So it was a little over $1 million. There's a little number right beside it that's $933,900. We had 2 big expenses, $62,000 and $19,000, that those were envelopes and postage that we basically prepaid. And so those are we can use that in 2019. All right? So the actual cost is going to be around $900,000. Mr. Dyson, if you look then over on the right-hand side, we've got a little section labeled projected typical VBM cost, and again, it's about $935. So that number is pretty close to that. In addition, in 2018, if I go back to the left-hand side of the page, we had some one-time costs. A couple of things that happened. I think we ordered some more computers at our accessible vote centers. Actually, I think we ordered did we order like 8 or 10 more computers? And at our election wrap-up, they asked for more computers. So even though we got more, they want more. So the total down there for including the one-times is that 1.04.
So I think you're going to tell me that the cost roughly $1 million, and if you look at the next
Yep.
group over in 2017, it was $614,000.
Correct.
And so, and we had what, roughly 10% more turnout than the past.
Not versus 2017. 2017, we had almost twice as many voters this time. But in 2015, the other mayoral, we had about 70,000.
Yeah, so it was 10,000 over our last highest, but over the last,
Mr. Chair, I think the mayoral that was 70,000 was the runoff, and I think this is probably just the election, which was probably around 50. So then, Mr. Dyson, to answer your question, to just keep running with that, what is the cost compare? And if you look in the projected typical vote by mail costs, if you look at, I've got highlighted printing, postage, and rentals. That is probably the increase from the old election to the new election. We have an increase in printing costs because instead of printing 70% of the ballots, we're printing over 100% of the ballots. We're printing envelopes and the postcards, so all of those costs are in there. The postage then for the mailing the ballots and the postcards, and then also the rental cost is for the election center, which we did have in 2017, and which I would suggest, even if we did go back to a poll-based election, I think you probably want us to have different space working out of your conference room, and the other spaces that we were working in City Hall was not effective, and it's probably not a very good use of office space. So that is how it compares to the prior elections.
Thank you.
Mr. Constant.
So from that perspective, thinking about the recent expense of $167,000 or so per year, that certainly raises the question of should we consider a purchase, because that's enough of an annual capital expense that we're paying in rent that within a short amount of time we could probably have a terrible building that we own and don't have to spend $167,000 every year to buy. So just to keep in our future planning.
Mr. Welton, unless Ms. Jones wants to respond to that first. Mr. Welton.
ML&P building might be available, and we might have some schools.
Right, and so just really contemplating that number, it seems like that's a lot of money. It's a good space, perfect use.
Although we did get significant tenant improvements, correct? And so, how, and it's a 5-year lease, is that right?
It's a 3-year lease, Mr. Chair, and then I think we did about 100,000 in tenant improvements.
Oh, that's actually not as much as I thought it was.
Well, but if you add those up, 3 years at 167,000, that's 500,000 plus 100,000, that's 600,000 in 3 years. That's a significant down payment in the future purchase of the building or repurposing of another municipal building that's not functioning. So that's not a mistake or anything. It certainly, this was a good experiment, and it's good to continue this experiment, I think. But really, if we're going to spend that much, we should pay ourselves.
Maybe. An interesting question to speak with the administration about going forward. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, looking at this, it looks like we spent about just under 70,000 on building improvements ourselves, 69,900. And so, how much additional improvements were made by the owners of the building? Do you know, or was most of the improvements stuff that we paid for?
You know, some of them we shared with the building owner, like for example, the handicapped ramp that's outside, I think the signs that they put up. So I think it was sort of a mix, some of the electrical, but I would need to have Rose Foley. She could probably answer that. I'm sorry, I don't know the exact answer to that, Mr. Peterson.
All right, thank you.
Would you like Ms. Foley to answer that, or?
If she has those numbers,
Through the chair, I can just speak to what we were invoiced for and not what the landlord paid for, but I'd be happy to get in touch with them and see if there were other building improvements that we were not invoiced for.
well, and you know, if we're going to consider moving over to an ML&P building in a couple of years, you know, most of the money that we've invested to improve that building will be a write-off because we'll have to walk away from it and start over and do the same thing at the next building that we go to. Now, some of that, those cages probably could be moved over to a different building. So not all of it would be money that would already have been spent. We would have to spend again, but so we have to take that into consideration. You know, what additional expenses we'd have to remodel our own building. Right, and then maintain it, of course.
You know what, that space, you know, for the next however many months, what, if anything, will happen in that space until we ramp up for the next election?
Well, probably we don't have a lot planned. We've offered it to people to use for meeting space. I think, you know, last year, Mr. Weddleton, it may have been the year before, Mr. Weddleton had the opera was down there practicing in the space.
Oh, they did do that.
They did. And so we'll continue to look for opportunities like that for the community to use the space, since there will be no ballots or any confidential information down there after that isn't secured, super secured, after probably about June 1st. So that would be one thing. And then also, as the Assembly and the Ethics and Elections Committee has directed us, and the steering committee, we're talking to the state about using the space, and we're also talking to the clerks in the valley about using the space. So we do have some other options.
Okay. Mr. Well.
So they're using the space. What's the interest in hiring us to run their election?
Mr. Weddleton, the Assembly, Ethics and Elections Committee, and the Steering Committee have directed our project manager. He is required to have those conversations with the state, and we have that scheduled May 7th through the 9th.
What do you mean? What kind of conversations exactly?
Asking the state if we can work on their elections.
Work on their, but not switching it to vote by mail yet. We're working on their conventional election. You mean actually, okay.
So you have the state, but you have Palmer, Wasilla, and Keeler.
Yes.
Fairbanks.
They could potentially run a vote by mail election. They would all require a change to their law, though.
Correct.
No, I know. I get it.
But the idea then is to use that space as a multi-jurisdictional election center.
Sure. But it would, I mean, it would require a major change to state law. Mr. Dyson?
Thanks. I don't need quite as elaborate an answer, but I assume that you spent, I think you went out of your way and went the extra mile to accommodate in these local voting centers and all those sort of things. Are there things that we did this year that you probably wouldn't choose to do again? And as we make this transition, the learning curve for the voters ought to flatten out. And so, are there some cost avoidances we can do the next session?
Definitely.
Like,
Well, I think one is we had workers down there, and what I told the workers was, if you have something to do, you can work. But if you don't have something to do, you need to go home. I think we wanted to schedule them because we didn't know. But next year we know. I know how to schedule them. I'm not going to have them down there. I think we'll save some money.
right. And will you continue to think it's good to have these voted person places?
I think that those are probably required. We overstaffed them this year, and I don't know that we'll need quite as much staff, and we also had a lot more ballots at those locations. So again, I think those will be able to save some costs.
Unused ballots.
Yes.
Like, yeah. And then I think you did a pretty darn good job of kind of trying to get the word out. There's lots of advertising and mailings and so on and so forth. Do you foresee that that will not be need to be as intensive in the future?
Mr. Dyson, through the chair, I think that is a decision for the Assembly and the Ethics and Elections Committee to give us some direction on. I actually think that you may want to think next year about a very aggressive outreach and education campaign. I think we know we had a couple of gaps, that we need to fix. And it's an assembly election. I think that the interest, because it was a mayoral election, may wax a little bit, and we want to make sure that. Sorry. So typically, we have lower voter turnout during assembly elections than mayoral elections. I think that we may want to, but it's up to the Assembly how you would like us to proceed with education and outreach. And unfortunately, it may cost some money, so that'll be a funding allocation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton, then Mr. Constant.
One point is, we door knock, and we really tell people, I don't know if mayor candidates, or school board candidates door knock, that's below them, but where's the cost of the ballot boxes that you're
Well, the drop boxes you bought the year before, and those are probably going to be in your capital expense. And I would like to double check with Rose about that.
And what's the project management? That's the big dollar. Project management, that's paid, you guys Wheeler and all.
RDI.
So you might get more of those drop boxes.
I would like to ask the Assembly if we could purchase additional drop boxes. I think that was one of the other things that came out of the responses from the public, from the election workers. And perhaps it goes to what Mr. Dyson was saying, maybe we have less staff at the accessible vote centers, but we probably need more drop boxes. Well, we do have a record of what the use was at the drop boxes. Amy Solberg did all of that management of location and negotiating. And my suggestion would be that we look really hard at the usage of those drop boxes and then make some analysis. Maybe we just need to move it to a different location So I was thinking more like, 3 or 4. I don't know, what are you thinking about for,
Through the chair, I would say probably 3 to 4.
okay.
And they're about 3,000 each, is that?
Is that all?
Mr., through the chair, I do not recall.
I'm back in PeopleSoft trying to find that information.
Okay.
I feel like it was more than 3,000, but I could be mistaken.
3,600 maybe, something like that.
Mr. Constant?
Yeah, I think additional to the Dropbox, we need an East Anchorage accessible vote center, one place in East Anchorage, so that the whole municipality has a place. And I don't know about Girdwood, but they didn't have any place to go other than the box. And you set up a handful of kind of accessible vote centers, the senior center, and places where you set those up. It would be nice to see how that fit into the matrix of locations. And I assume there's still a final polished report that's coming, right? Okay. And with the, back to Mr. Dyson's question on how we promoted the election, advertising was just one of the costs of that, right? And we had staffing, we had advertising. What other costs? It would be nice to see in communications what we actually spent on that part of the election in a kind of separate breakdown that's pretty discreet, because then we will be able to make an assessment. Because like Mr. Dunbar has said, oh, we spent 60,000 or 59.5. I think it's not that right. There's a different number what we spent on getting the word out.
Through the chair, you're correct, Mr. Constant. The advertising, the 59.5, primarily is those formal election notices that go in the Anchorage Daily News. That isn't necessarily the cost of radio or TV or our Facebook advertising. I think we do need to make it very clear that all of the print, the brochures, the flyers, the posters, all of that came through MOA reprographics, and we're charged an IGC for that, but there was no actual cost for us. And as all of you saw, the work was incredibly professional and well done. So that is a huge benefit for us.
We also had Carolyn, right? So her salary was not included in the advertising budget.
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Yeah, and I think there is a concern also about some unlearning that's going to take place in November, right? People that are now used to vote by mail are going to have to go back to their polling place, unfortunately.
They're going to be mad at us.
Hopefully they'll be mad at the state.
Some of them will be.
Some will be mad at us, some will be mad at the state, and then when it comes April 2019, they'll be mad at us again. And it'll just be this way until basically until the state decides to come over to vote by mail. Well, that's all the questions we have, Ms. Jones. Do you have another topic you want to present on, or do you want to, or we go into audience participation?
No, Mr. Chair, we don't have anything else.
Ms. Foley.
I was just going to get back with Mr. Peterson on the cost of the drop boxes. They're about $2,900 plus a few hundred in freight, and then there's decaling that goes on the outside and some tamper protection measures that are also taken that would add a few $100s probably to that cost.
Round the money. Yep. So just one last note. I want to thank you again. That was epically well rolled out first vote by an election. And I look forward to seeing more data on the actual returns, and I want to be prepared because in my district we more than double participation in this election in almost every market. So thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. Chair, that reminded me, I do have some statistics that I promised to get back to you, and I'll do a formal response to you. I think that there was an email that was circulating regarding voter turnout, and so I had staff go back and they had to pull out the paper copies of the election returns from our vault to get this information. But it is true that this election was the highest number of voters participating since we have kept records in 1976. Now, the question that was posed in the email that you got concerned percentage of voter turnout. And so because of the vagaries of the number of registered voters, which I will provide to you, it is true that this was not the highest percentage voter turnout, that there are a couple of other elections, and you can take a look at that and see the reasons for the difference in the percentages, but I will provide that to you.
Great.
Okay?
Wonderful. Ms. France.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question from Ms. Jones. On Wednesday at the Ethics and Elections meeting, you talked a little bit about the issue of postage and how that came up as feedback that this be viewed as a poll tax. And I understand that your office is looking into ways we might be able to address that, or and I know part of that is limited to by federal law and the fact that bulk mail does not show the date. Would you mind just summarizing how you're thinking about approaching?
Certainly. Through the chair, the issue that the Assembly looked at when it originally passed the ordinance and made a decision not to pay for return postage was that there's no postmark. And so that it's important, the way we currently do elections is that it's postmarked on election day. So one of the important things that I would like to remind you is that we received the largest number of ballots on election day. I think it was about 13 trays of mail. We received 11 trays of mail the day after the election. So, and there was more mail that we received after that. None of those ballots would count. And the thing that I think that's important if the Assembly makes this change is that it's a very big change for our voters, and it means it would be different than the state. One of the things that we've tried to do with our election code is keep things the same. So I think that is a big issue that the Ethics and Election Committee has to address. And we're going to have a code redrafting meeting, and it is something that is certainly on the table to look at. The one comment that I would make as far as it appearing as a poll tax, the issue is that you do not have to vote by mail. And by increasing the number of drop boxes will make it easier for voters to return their ballot without having to use a stamp. We also will increase the number of accessible vote centers. Amy has been in touch with Mr. Dunbar and Mr. Peterson about a location for an accessible vote center in East Anchorage. So again, we're trying to make it easier for voters. So I expect that that we may see an increase in voters not using the mail to return them. We need to probably work on our education and outreach next year to make sure that voters know they don't have to return it by mail. We can work on that. At the time of when the Assembly originally passed this ordinance, there was a discussion whether there was a private sector economic effect that needed to be reported on the C. And the Assembly at that time, and I believe the sponsors were the Ethics and Elections Committee, the decision was that because the cost of a stamp was probably less than gas to drive to a polling location, that there was no private sector economic effect. And I hope that answers your questions and the issues that the Assembly needs to address on that issue.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Seeing no other questions, we'll have a time for audience participation if anyone would like to raise any issues. And then we can end this a little bit early and take a break until the next work session. So is there anyone from the administration or from the public that would like to ask a question or make a comment? Yes, please state your name and spell it for the record.
My name is Eugene Carl Haberman. I represent myself. I live in Atkinson Valley. All the public process done appropriate decision made by the governing body, more like public interest. No other vote by mail thing. You made reference about the idea of the state going vote by mail. Roughly a year ago, I attended the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, last advisory item, and we were the head of the Division of Elections, dealing with rural Alaska, Native vote, and all that. message came out there was is that the car to vote by mail won't work right now in rural Alaska. I would advise you to check the reports out of that because this message about the risk to stay and go where you have already tested it, you got to deal with mail. And it's one thing to mail in Anchorage, Alaska, and another thing to do with rural. And I would caution you to, on the words of direction, let's do it by state, because there's problems there, and the state's aware of that. The other thing is, just to point out, is on the election that you had here, this new thing that you did, an advertising campaign and vote by mail. But what dominated what I saw was, and you can see, public could see on the advertising campaign, and I'm glad you did an advertising campaign, but the message was basically focused on vote by mail. It wasn't clear that they had other options. The effective voter centers didn't come into very late. So the end result is that you can vote by mail. That wasn't really clear. The limited number of locations is also a problem, a serious problem. I remind you in the presidential election back in Bush, with Florida, the long lines of people voting. When you limit the number here and more people are having less trust with government, they would like to feel more secure and personally go and hand it to someone, not even in a box. And when you have these limited numbers you do have, it's going to cause a problem here because I can see the situation is long lines and more problems. And there was one other thing I wanted to say, I forget, that I'm limited comments, it's off my mind is here. But I think that's basically it. I'm probably going to remember, and that's it. But this was quite informative. Thank you very much for having this type of meeting. And thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. Remarkably positive testimony. With that, I'll note for the record that Mr. Trainee has joined us, but we are going to close this work session.